So, welcome to today's episode from the Vet Project, all about neurodiversity in the veterinary sector. Now, the topic that we've chosen for today, big topic for us, something that we're very passionate about, anxiety and neurodivergence, how it works for us, what it looks like for us, and how often it shows up. So, Helen, do you want to start us off by just giving us some facts and figures, some lovely fun stats around prevalence of anxiety and neurodivergence?
Yes, lovely fun stats. So, the National Autistic Society says that 40 to 50% of autistic people have a clinical diagnosis of anxiety, and 47% of people would fall into the severe category based on the generalized anxiety disorder criteria. So that's autistic people. Uh, with ADHD, there is a large study that shows that more than half the people that have ADHD in that particular study reported that they also had one or more anxiety disorders, and the rates are higher for females as well.
I think that's across the board, so for children and for adults.
Mhm.
And I think there's a very alarming statistic around children having a 10 times higher prevalence for anxiety and depression than their neurotypical peers, which I just think is a shocking stat. So it's a big feature of the neurodivergent experience. It's a big part of what we have to deal with. I mean, I always like to joke that neurodivergent people are just a bit stressed a lot of the time, most of the time. It's why I was
Armor
so good in a
crisis, right?
crisis. Yeah, calm in a crisis, just because it's no different from everyday life, no different from just
Total
existing.
crisis.
Anxiety is definitely something that I relate to very strongly. Something that's been a feature. In fact, it was how I found out about ADHD. Was I was researching anxiety in my role as a performer and creating workshops around it because it had been such an issue for me, and then discovered myself in ADHD. And of course, that explained everything. How's it shown up for you? Has it been a feature of your experience, a feature of your life or your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about here, aren't we, the feeling of anxiety and our experiences of it, rather than clinical diagnoses of
Yes,
anxiety.
very important to say that we are not clinical psychologists.
Mhm.
So we're not talking about it from the point of view of clinical psychology. And the way we talk about anxiety is from a coaching, very practical perspective, not necessarily looking to diagnose anybody, not necessarily talking about conditions like generalized anxiety disorder. These discussions, just to put in the disclaimer, are more around the experience of it and what we've learned as coaches working in the industry and helping people to put in practical tools, interventions that might help support that side of the neurodivergent conditions. Now, saying those statistics, we tend to talk a lot about autism and ADHD, partly because there's so much more research. But of course, that's not to say, and we'll talk about why this is, say, to people with dyslexia, I always say it wrong, dyscalculia, dyscal, this, a little bit of overlap there. Maybe there's some dyslexia going on, who knows? And other neurodivergent conditions would have the same rates of occurrence. But the studies tend to be around the large populations.
Yeah, so thinking about our experiences, I think my experience with anxiety is that it's just been kind of present all the time, like you're saying, it does hang around a lot. For me specifically, I think. So much so that it is I use it as a kind of task initiation tool and a motivational tool. And it's been a real learning journey for me, journey of self-discovery and kind of strategies to try and um, motivate myself without using anxiety. So anxiety is something that was ever present in work. If there's a big consulting list or a big ops list, anxiety is what would get me through that. Um, and we talk, don't we, in our anxiety workshop about if you're not feeling anxious enough, you have a cup of coffee because it just doesn't feel quite right. So it's the absence of that now in my life is quite weird, and it's something
Mm.
that I've had to get used to try and motivate myself without anxiety. But certainly, I think I struggle to talk about it a bit because I I'm not sure I recognise it for what it is sometimes because it was just a constant thing.
It's
definitely.
interesting, isn't it? Being hooked on that feeling of being stressed or
Mm,
feeling like you need to be stressed to be able to do stuff. I had a friend recently who struggled to write essays, university student, and so would leave it to the last minute. And it just became the pattern, the habit. This is how I write essays. I get so sort of racked with stress and anxiety, leave it to the last minute, and then use that adrenaline push to try and get through the essay, right? And you stay up for a night, a few nights, a week, just to try
mm.
and get it done with that stress.
And that kind
And
of
then, of course, be ruined
works.
for a week afterwards. This is the problem. It does work
Yeah.
sometimes. It's a very valuable tool. But if you're relying on it permanently or more often than your body's designed for it, then you very quickly pay the price for it.
Yeah, and I think if it was like once every few weeks to write an essay, that would be one thing. I think in the veterinary space, often it's all the time. And we see, if we overuse that as a initiation thing and as a productivity tool, essentially, and then that's when we can struggle with burnout and depletion of those neurotransmitters and those, chemicals that we're using to get through our day to day. And then we kind of are surprised that we can't switch off at the end of the day and we can't rest effectively. But we're just well, certainly my experience was of using anxiety to get through and to be productive in inverted commas.
And I think if you think about the neurodivergent experience, there's just a lot more opportunities for moments which would cause anxiety to occur. So, if I'm dyslexic, I'm worried about reading things. I'm worried about making a mistake over something that I've read or seen. That's going to create anxiety all the time because I have to read stuff all the time. I have to read patient notes. I've got to, make sure I filled out the prescriptions right, all that kind of stuff. So you're constantly on high alert, which I think means sort of ratcheting up this stress response to kind of check, am I doing it right? Have I dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's and everything, to make sure that I'm doing it right. And the irony is that, of course, when you're in that stressed out state, you're more likely to make mistakes because your brain doesn't function in the same way.
So often in my coaching clients, people are worried that if they drop the anxiety, they're going to drop, we're often spinning plates, aren't we, so rapidly, and that seems to be fueled by anxiety. And one of the big worries that people have, I think, is if I'm less anxious, if I kind of let my guard down and let my kind of stress levels down a little bit, um, am I not going to be able to do the things that I can do now? And that's a real worry. And I always say, like, that's not the case. It's not the case that you'll become less effective if you're less anxious. Um, but it's something that you've got to experience for yourself, I think, isn't it?
It's a hard line of, am I really trying? Am I really working it if it's not costing me? If I'm not at the edge of my capabilities, which means being super stressed. If I make a mistake and I was relaxed, how much am I going to beat myself up about that?
Mm.
If I'm neurodivergent and I'm aware that I'm more likely to make mistakes, I'm more likely to do things
Mm.
differently, which we might perceive as being, making mistakes or doing it and not the way you're supposed to.
Yeah, and there's loads, as you said, there's loads of different ways in which anxiety could become a part of our experience. I think, sensory overload, for example. If there's I mean, light is my big sensory overload one, and noise to a certain extent. But so I am going to feel anxious if it's really bright all the time and I'm starting to get a headache, and it's that that's just not going to be something that's experienced by neurotypical people in the same way.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of the simple things, isn't it? The sensory overload just from the lights or the noise, which can change, or if it is any of the executive function stuff that you're
Hmm.
expected to do and expected to be normal, which might be harder for you,
Hmm.
then it'll build that social anxiety. It'll build if someone's expecting you to have sent them the thing, but you have a lot of executive function issues around it for some reason. Uh, then that's going to create a social anxiety. It's going to create a negative peer pressure for you because this task feels so big, but there's this deadline, and none of us want to get found out. I think a lot of the anxiety that builds up, it's communication differences, it's ways of doing it difference, it's speed of thought differences that create anxiety based on the expectations around you, based on the expectations of how we do it, based on the expectations of the system. And so that all of these little things, I always talk about the anxiety brick wall. These mini anxieties are cumulative and they accumulate to a place where we start to feel it much more acutely. And I think that's where we go into really difficult sensory places where anxiety feels really bad, and that leads to very quickly burnout
Mm.
or more serious conditions.
Yeah, and you were talking about expectations there, and I think that's key for me. So, and not knowing what the expectations are is a big one, I think. So, for me, I didn't have a lot of social anxiety at work. I don't think in the clinical setting, I know who I am, I know who I'm supposed to be. I'm playing the role of vet. And I'm not saying that's not quite maths, but it because it was sometimes, but it was it was I knew what I was doing. I knew what was expected of me. The social anxiety for me comes on things like the school run. Like, I don't know, like what people expect of me in that space. I don't know whether to say hi to people or ignore people or yeah. I have loads of social anxiety really randomly around the school run because I don't know what the rules are. I don't really know what the expectations are. So I think there's something there, isn't there, about laying out the expectations, whether it's for yourself or whether that's with a leader or manager. If you know what the expectations are, it's much, much easier to follow those sort of unspoken or unwritten rules.
Or if you add to that the idea, what if you find it difficult reading social cues, or you're an overthinker, so you come away going, okay, well, did I say the right thing? Was the right,
Mm.
especially if your anxiety is starting to build, that feeling that, anxiety I talk about is being like extra energy. It's extra energy to deal with a difficult situation.
Mm.
Just for a lot of us, that difficult situation isn't something that's happening now. It's something that happened a long time ago, but the brain is still feeding you the energy to deal with it. And so you add in, difficulty reading social cues. Did I say the right thing? Did I respond to that in a way that they understood me? Because I think we all struggle with things around being understood in the right way. Did I communicate in the right way? Uh, and so yeah, all of this is adding to those situations.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things at work is that, especially if you're late diagnosed, I think there's so many barriers to support, or we perceive that there's barriers to support, whether they're there or not. And they may be, but they may not be. Um, in terms of, asking for support, asking line managers, disclosing, there's a lot of barriers to kind of getting what we need and knowing what we need. Um, and that I think that's quite anxiety provoking for a lot of people, and certainly for me.
Seriously, if we talk about it in more general terms, are you allowed to be anxious? Are you allowed to have that kind of buildup of anxious energy in the veterinary profession, or is it a case of, well, you just got to get on with it?
I think it's almost an expectation. I think we're almost expected to be anxious. We're expected to be like on the go. Certainly from my point of view, you're expected to be on very high alert all of the time. Or
Is that
maybe that's
is that a positive thing? Does that help people?
no, no. I've never thought about it before, actually. Maybe it's a self-expectation. Maybe that's just me. Um, but I do think there's a real performance pressure um culture sometimes, a
Mm.
real, consults coming through the door or ops coming through the door, and we're expected to be always on. And one of the ways to be always on is to remain anxious, to remain vigilant and high alert. And
And I think it
yeah.
kind of depends on how your anxiety affects you. So if you're
Mm,
someone that your anxiety, you get the feeling of anxiety. And of course, talking about anxiety, it's just that feeling of discomfort. Something in your body says something's unsafe. I often describe anxiety as an overestimation of the problem and an underestimation of my ability to cope with it.
mhm,
And that's what anxiety is for a lot of people. So then we worry about, how am I going to survive it? What can I do? What did I do to survive it last time? And we all tend to develop a pattern of behavior around it. So
mhm,
sometimes some people I get anxious and I get really hyperactive and hypervigilant and I'm spotting everything and doing everything. Some people get anxious and shut down. Some people get anxious and their body decides they need to get out of that situation. Looks like being angry, confrontational, having a meltdown. And so I think we all have our patterns, and
mhm,
it depends on your pattern how that anxiety feeling, how that energetic drive comes out in you.
mm. What about you then? Because I've talked about kind of high performance expectations in veterinary, and that's how you came to anxiety and neurodivergence. So how did that look for you?
So I was an opera singer, traveling the world, doing my opera thing, and a lot of the time I loved it. It's great, brilliant, new places, lots of travel, really fitted with my neurodivergent brain, lots of exciting things, lots of challenges. And then there were the moments when the anxiety would hit. So a lot of that was around auditions. I really needed the job. I had this like 10 minutes to perform. You'd got on a plane, you'd traveled somewhere, you on stage for 10 minutes. In that 10 minutes, you had to show everyone how incredible you were. And I'd really struggle with it. So that I'd have me on stage, brilliant, great performer, me in auditions, so closed down, such a negative physical experience. Sometimes couldn't even make words or I'd forget the words and it would affect me in a really negative way. So that's how come I started looking at anxiety. I was like, okay, well, look, I'm not getting the jobs because I can't perform in the auditions. So I tend to get lots of repeat work, but I need the new stuff, in the new places that I'm getting the opportunity to go and sing to. And so that's what I was trying to fix was how do I, in that 10-minute short burst, manage the anxiety so that I can breathe, so I can think, so I can perform. And that's kind of where it all started was trying to find practical tools to be able to deal with that. The answer seemed to be go to therapy for 10 years. I just didn't have that kind of time. And as it turned out, it wasn't about that. It wasn't about those deep underlying issues that tend to be what drive a lot of anxiety. For me, it was about a nervous system based on a neurodivergent brain. So just to explain what I mean by that, neurodivergence often characterized as a neurodevelopmental condition. So our brain develops back to front, inside to out, and the stuff at the back and in the middle is the survival caveman. It's the amygdala. It's all those parts that would be part of this anxiety drive, and it develops much slower into the executive function parts of the brain, the front of the brain, the outside of the brain which would control those energetic spikes, which would be, emotional regulation, which would be logical planning of things and stuff like that. So what we're left with is a brain that is more likely to respond in those situations, the kind of hunter brain, as people like to describe it, where we go from 0 to 100 like that, straight up there. Something triggers us, and that's it. Nervous system goes right up there to be able to cope with that situation. And then in a lot of neurodivergent brains, it takes a lot longer to come down again. It's looking like days, weeks, even, depending on, I had an argument with someone on Facebook. Okay, great, I'm right up there, and it takes me weeks to get rid of the energy of that. I'm there overthinking the argument in my head. Uh, and that's how it is. And in that time, of course, we can go right back up again. So this
Mm.
is the nervous system that we tend to be dealing with, whether it's an autistic experience where there's a lot of sensory stuff that's going to trigger that nervous system into take action mode, whether it's an ADHD nervous system, which is just lacking the executive function to manage those spikes. And I think that's the important difference. So neurotypical anxiety, we have baseline somewhere down here, and we have the spikes in the big situations. Uh, Neurodivergent anxiety experience, we tend to be much higher up a lot of the time. So the spikes are shorter spikes, which is why good in a crisis, but the intensity of it and the frequency of it is much more regular, so much more intense, much more frequent. So we have we it's one of the struggles of being neurodivergent is that you struggle to be in these anxiety states a lot of the time.
Mm. And what was interesting for me when you came to talk to that's how we met. You came to talk to my choir about anxiety and performance anxiety, and I could relate a lot of the veterinary experience to what you were saying about performance anxiety. We know veterinary is a high performance career, but it, what really struck me was, that almost the simplicity of the tools that you were talking about, and how relatable they were to practice life, and how kind of similar that was. And I think, yeah, that's something that we still use, isn't it? We talk about the simplicity of these tools and what we can use.
And I think that's one of the values of that workshop that we also give for vets and is just understanding. It's this
Mm,
stuff that should be taught in school, should be taught in primary school. Like these are your emotions, this is how it works, this is what's happening. And instead, certainly at least for our generation, I think they're much better at talking about the big feelings and how
yeah,
you deal with it in
yeah.
schools now. We just didn't have that emotional education. this stuff would be going on, and you'd have no clue how to deal with it. And it was just like, get on with it. Stiff upper lip. Let's crack on. You're feeling a bit anxious. You're anxious about going on stage, right? You need to do more of that. Get them on stage more. And it's a bit like I liken it to learning how to swim. And people are like, oh, the only way to learn how to swim is just throw you in the lake. And of course, some people will be thrown in the lake, kind of learn how to swim, manage. And some people won't. Some people will find it a horrific experience and then will be afraid of the water. And I think that's kind of, as a society, how we deal with this kind of stuff. So if something scary, do it more,
Mm.
expose yourself to it, rather than something scary. Okay, learn the tools, learn what's going on here, understand your body, and then we'll look at how we approach this, how we unwire the reaction that said this thing was scary in the first place. Or
Mm.
is it necessary? Do we want to be scared of this thing? Is it necessary to have that extra energy? And once I started learning the tools around performance, tools around anxiety management, my performances became exponentially better. I, went to some really great places because I finally understood how to manage what was going on. I finally understood what was going on. Didn't have to shut me down. And then what I was left with was these massive amounts of energy, performance energy, uh, that I could do something with. I could put into my performance to make it even better, rather than it being something that I had to fight against and was shut me down. I wasn't 100% successful, I have to say. It didn't work all of
I
the
mean, who
time.
is ever?
Yeah, but often enough, I was able to sort of access it as a positive thing. I like to think about Olympic athletes. Olympic athletes don't set world records in training. They wait till there's 100 million people watching on the telly and there's 100,000 people in the stadium and they're competing against the best in the world, and that's when they set the world records because they've got that extra something, that extra juice, that extra energy to be able to manage it, to be able to put into their performance, and do superhuman things.
So how did it show up for you then? What was your experience?
So many different experiences where anxiety really affected me. So I remember one time I was in Amsterdam singing to the Nederlands Opera, and I'd gone to do this audition. Of course, you get the first plane out of London because it's the cheapest one you can get. So you arrive at like 5 a.m. whatever, and then I had a couple of espressos because I arrived at 5 a.m. a bit sleepy, and of course a couple of espressos on top of an ADHD nervous system full of anxiety. I got into this audition and singing this incredibly famous aria that I'd sung like 100 times that week. You know what I mean? This is my go-to, and I forgot the words. I just forgot them. And so I was there
Mm.
just like making up Italian in this audition, Tagliatelle, Raffanelli, Pavarotti, in front of incredibly famous people, one big music festival and from the Opera House. And they must have thought I was an absolute lunatic. It was just because the anxiety had affected my brain. I don't think, do we talk about how it affects the brain? Anxiety, we feel it in the body, we know all the body stuff, but the same stuff happens in the brain, so we forget stuff, we can't think straight. It's all part of that anxiety response. It's all what the cortisol does to your body and your brain. And I just forgot it. And in the moment, I thought it was perfectly great. I walked out those doors, I was like, just nailed it. Absolutely killed that audition. No way they could have noticed I was singing like Tagliatelle top of my lungs. And of course, it wasn't until I got down the road and my nervous system calmed down a little bit that I realized what I'd just done, how ridiculous it was. Or it also affected me physically. So a lot of the time it was around the breath. I couldn't breathe, and then I couldn't get the notes out as well as I wanted to. Or one time I was on stage backstage and stood on this like scaffolding which holds up the set, and my leg shakes, and it's rattling the scaffolding, it's rattling the whole set. It's like jiggly leg before I go on, and I can see this technician like running around the backstage, being like, "What is that? What's happening? what's
That's
what's
broken.
yeah, what's broken? What's about to fall from this massive set?" It was just my leg in a very rhythmic jiggle through the nervousness, and it was just like the energy of it trying to come out of my body. And we shake when there's too much energy in the muscle for the muscle to be able to contain it, so the muscle starts just releasing that energy in the form of a movement. And so yeah, it starts like that. It's interesting how we deal with it. So depending on your version of anxiety, either you suck it up and you try and get on with it, and you just deal with the horrific feeling of it a lot of the time, and you stop looking forward to those opportunities, or you actively keep yourself away from situations where you might be exposed to those uncomfortable feelings, whether they're social or work or whatever it is. In fact, I remember one client came, highly successful, worked in London in highly successful business, and she got to a stage in her career where she had to give talks to, these huge clients that her company was working with, and she was going to leave the business because she just didn't want to give these talks. She also didn't want to tell anyone. She didn't want to give these talks. These talks were just so horrifically painful for her that she was going to leave a job because she just couldn't deal with those very specific situations. Um, and that's what it can look like. It needn't necessarily be the generalized anxiety that it can grow into when it's not dealt with. But it can be very, very specific situations that then you're worried about, you anticipate being caught up in.
I think that's how it shows up for me in a clinical context. So, um, worrying about a specific procedure, and then what do you do about that? Like, do you smash through and just try it and hope for the best? Or do you avoid it? That they're basic. If you haven't got any techniques or you don't really have the psychoeducation to know what's going on, they're basically your options, aren't they? Smash through, hope for the best. Probably, have a really shaky surgery or whatever it is that you're trying to do. Have a horrendous evening trying to recover afterwards, or just not do it. And then again, feel awful because you've not done it and you've avoided it again and ruminate on that. And so either way, from a mental health point of view, not ideal, really. Um, and so I think just putting in these like small techniques to try and do something different. Well, first realizing that you need to do something different, I think, and then putting in some strategies to calm the nervous system, to really kind of
To
be present
regulate.
and
So what we're
things.
talking about, we're talking about regulating.
Regulate.
How do I regulate in this
Yeah.
situation? How do I stay regulated? How do I keep my
Yeah.
brain online and my physical body comfortable?
Because it will sabotage your surgery. There's a potential there for stuff to go wrong because you're not thinking straight. We know that anxiety affects people's logical thought. It's not, you can't
Mm.
do logical
It's
thought.
interesting, isn't it? It's still considered a weakness. Oh, you get anxious,
Mm,
so you need to toughen up. You need to be, a stronger person. But actually, it's the opposite. It's a sign of good evolution. If you are an anxious person, it's a sign that your brain is highly developed. Because obviously, the anxious person would spot the danger, would spot the tiger hiding in the grass, would spot the dinner,
mm.
and be able to respond much quicker than the very chilled out person who would almost certainly be lunch. So, from an evolutionary point of view, it's a sign of good development. If you're more likely to have high anxiety. In fact, I think that the places I've found the most anxious people I've ever met have been places of high intelligence. So Oxbridge, MIT, Harvard, these kind of places. I was lucky enough to teach at Oxford University for a little while. And I've never known a group of more anxious, neurotic people in my life. The amount of questions I had to get so much better at my topic, just for the amount of random questions people would come up with as sort of an anxiety response, sort of questioning the topic. So it was actually really good for pushing me to learn much deeper. I needed answers for everything, and they had to be the right ones. But yeah, this correlation between high intelligence, evolved brains, and the anxiety response is definitely there.
And that's an
As
interesting
a
point,
as
isn't it? Like, I think, there's a point there about anxiety, the usefulness of anxiety. So driving you to be better at your topic, driving people to ask questions of you, which, were useful, I'm sure. And then there's a point, isn't there, where it hijacks your performance, and it makes you forget the words and it makes you, not know what's next in surgery and the logical thought goes out the window. And there's a fine line there, isn't there? And there's something about realizing those two states and utilizing one rather than the other, isn't there, as well?
I think that's probably where the kind of social stigma comes from, the weakness side of it, and therefore the shame that we build around it. I got to a stage where my anxiety affected me negatively. There's shame around that, do I laugh
Mm,
about it? Do I tell people about it? Do I keep it to myself? Do I find a way to deal with it. I don't know. Um, but there's definitely a shame element. Something about me was wrong, is bad because I couldn't cope with this feeling that I created in my own body, my thoughts created in that moment of high performance when I needed to be able to deal with it, when everything, my identity that I built around is around being a good vet, being good at surgery. And when I couldn't cope with that, of course, that's going to have an effect. That's going to have a big effect, and probably why we're more likely to avoid those situations rather than try and push
Mm.
through with what could be an incredibly negative feeling from it.
Yeah, and that leads into masking a bit as well. So I think masking creates anxiety and can be caused by anxiety as well. There's a double, yeah, it's both ways, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's how interesting. I'm just thinking about uh, how we often get anxious about being anxious.
Yeah.
One of
Oh,
one of the
yeah.
ways it was shown for me on stage, especially when you're in a warm country, warm theatre, I'd struggle to regulate my temperature. So I get very
Mm.
hot, which would mean I'd sweat. And then, of course, you get super anxious, and you know you're anxious because this is not normal. No one around you is sweating, but you're sweating away on stage, and you know that people can see that you're sweaty. Like the audience must be able to see this sweat dripping down, over my eyes, smudging my makeup. And so you start to panic about the fact that people can see the anxiety response. I think
Yeah.
it's one of the important things to recognize about anxiety is your body brain create this high level of energy, and then the brain tries to find labels for it. So I think this is partly where the rumination part comes in. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But you try and find a label. Why have I got this feeling? What is it about? What is the danger, basically? What do I
Mm.
feel in danger from? And if it can't find stuff. It kind of makes stuff up based on what have I been through, what my experiences, what's my lovely trauma. I'm going to have a route around that to try and explain this internal feeling of discomfort or the level of it in this moment, even though the level of it may just be a neurodivergent brain over responding as it's prone to, or having more experiences of it that required more energy, or having a coping mechanism, which is I need a vast amount of energy to push through this uncomfortable situation. Uh, and it's interesting how then, because this often takes a lot longer to subside in a neurodivergent brain, how this labeling can creep into other parts of your life. I'm still feeling anxious and uncomfortable. What could it possibly be? The situation is over. Logically, logic brain knows that. I'm not in surgery anymore, but I'm still feeling anxious and uncomfortable. What could it possibly be? Could it be the house is a mess? Could it be my partner? Could it be, this other thing, my family member, this situation? The frustration at the traffic or whatever it is, or at the government. And so we find ways, labels for to try and explain what this internal feeling could be, what the danger is. And I think that's where it gets even more complicated because we then start blaming things that aren't to blame for the internal situation, or certainly not the volume of it.
Yeah, I think just the knowledge that when we go up, you know, emotionally, it takes us longer to come down, and being able to label it as that rather than, well, I must be stressed about this or stressed about that. Again, it is that psychoeducation, isn't it? Like just making sense of it, and the more we know about ourselves, if you know that that's you, it makes it much easier, I think, to come to terms with it and strategize around that.
Yeah, definitely. Even just being able to recognize when you're in that state, because
Mm,
it can feel so comfortable, it can feel so normal. The chaos can just become your daily life.
yeah.
Um, Being able to recognize this is a stressed out state. Okay, do I want to be in this? Is this appropriate? Is this going to help me? Is this the right level of stress for this environment, for this situation? And being able to work out, okay, well, how can I shift? Can I shift? Do I need to hide under a blanket for a bit? Do I need to take myself away for a bit? Do I need to go for a walk? As ways to regulate that nervous system so that I can be left with an appropriate amount of that anxiety energy for this situation.
And who knows what an appropriate amount of
Who knows?
energy is
Who
for any
knows?
given
Still
situation.
working it out. If you're performing well, is it the right amount or is it negative? I don't know, but a personal journey, all part of the journey. Um, yeah, definitely part of and I think that's true for everything, isn't it? Just how do I stay curious? But in
Mm,
this situation, how do I stay curious and know the appropriate measures of it, the appropriate baseline? What is zero anxiety? I have no idea. Never experienced it in my life. The big question people are going to be asking, listening to all of this, is okay, what can I do about it? If anxiety is an issue for me, what are the answers? Where do I go? Much like I was when I was searching for the answers to help me with my performance. Where do I find support, help, solutions? What does it look like?
Mhm. Yes, and the answer for me when we first met was come to your anxiety workshop. So that's what we did, didn't we? We read one for vets. So we do have one that we run an online evening workshop, and
Not,
all of
not
these
just
things in
not
more
just to plug
detail.
ourselves, but going to that workshop is very has been very useful. A lot of people find it very useful, and of course the content in that workshop is just this is what it is. This is really
Yeah.
what's going on. This is how to change the mindset around it, how to rethink what anxiety is and what it does to you, and then here's practical solutions. So fundamentally, anxiety is a physical response. Do I need to do physical stuff? It's very hard to argue logic in an anxiety state. This is a primal response, and that primal bit of the brain doesn't really deal with language very well. It doesn't have any language, so we need to deal with it in a different way, in a more proactive feelings way, to re-educate the system, and often just get rid of that chemical buildup that's creating the feedback loop.
We make an action plan basically, don't we? Which is, what we all
Yeah.
need. When we're anxious or not feeling great, it's very difficult to make decisions about what to do to scale that anxiety back.
Yeah, I think
And
that's
so,
the main thing, isn't it? When you're in that state, you can't think.
yeah,
What do I need
yeah,
to do? I have no idea. Brain is braining. I
yeah,
need to run away a lot of the time and just
yeah.
shut down and just go and hide in a cave. And often they're not realistic options for us in most situations. So
Sadly, yeah.
so I think it's about what is the plan? What is my breathing app that I go to? How much time do I know that I'm going to need sitting in the Harry Potter cupboard, hiding away to sort of to re-regulate, I think one of the things that we've kind of touched on, I think we have to have a few more podcast episodes on the anxiety topic, is all of the little mini anxieties that we have for as a neurodivergent person, all those little things, oh, I must get on with that thing, or I must do that thing that we try and hold present or think about. How am I going to manage that situation coming up? How am I going to manage that trip to the family? How am I going to manage that, that surgery, whatever it is, that is part of the rumination state. It's interesting talking about rumination and neurodivergence because our brains work differently to be able to deal with that than neurotypicals. So neurotypicals could do task positive behavior. That would be a way to stop the rumination. I would, book a holiday, do something nice, bake a cake. As neurodivergent people, we tend to be better at things like multitasking. So we can ruminate on the problem and do the task butter and book the holiday. It can all be going on in the background. So we need different strategies which are more around going to the sensations of the body, which sometimes can be a struggle if we have poor interoception. That's not a strength of ours to be able to combat this and take it out of the overthinking part of the brain and into other more sensory parts of the brain, which then bring the logic and the thinking back online. Um, so I think that's one of the main things that people need to be aware of to be able to deal with is what's my relationship to that and how can I come out of it. That's part of the curiosity is what kind of action plan is going to work for me, what tools, because it's not going to be the same as everybody else. It's not going to be what it says on Google. It's going to have to be something that you come up with for yourself based on your experiences, based on what works for you. Maybe even experimenting, trying new things, he says. Um,
Yeah, and we've got the little 5 4 3 2 1 mindfulness exercise, haven't we, on the YouTube channel as well. So you can go and have a look at that and see if that's useful for you as a starting point.
Yeah, as a
Brilliant.
way to turn back on the brain, or a way to get back into that sensory part of the brain, to then be able to unlock the more logical, okay, am I really in danger? Is there really a tiger? Part of the
Mhm.
brain to reflect on the
There isn't
situation.
usually. There isn't usually a
Usually,
tiger.
usually. Uh, well, I was creating a PDF the other day and found a great photo of a bunch of vets around a massive tiger that had been intubated and had its jaw sort of wide open for the surgery it was going to go through, which I think just summed up how a lot of us feel. Yeah, every consult feels like we're treating that lion, that massive creature, whether it's about the animal, whether it's about the client, whether it's about the paperwork, the admin, the scheduling.
It's a nice mental picture to leave you with.
Beautiful mental. But I feel like I need to put this picture in the comments or something. However,
Yeah,
however
definitely.
we do this podcast thing. Uh, Excellent. Right, well, we'll see you all for our next intrepid uh, adventure into all things neurodivergent and veterinary industry with the Vet Project podcast series. If you enjoyed this episode, please send it to a friend, a colleague, a family member, and give us a like or a follow or a subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it could keep us making content to support our tribe. And if you want to work with us, or you want to join the tribe or collect your free resources, just head over to our website, www.thevetproject.co.uk, or send us an email at info@thevetproject.co.uk. And we will look forward to welcoming you on the next episode of The Vet Project podcast.